Hi, it's Dr. Lori Stevick-Rust. I know that we've been spending some time talking about anxiety and fear and overwhelm and exhaustion and fatigue, and I've heard from many of you the current strain and stress that you are under, but I've also started to hear from several of you talking about the struggle with grief. And so I thought today we could spend a little bit of time talking about grief. You know, grief is one of those things that we don't often like to talk about. It makes us feel helpless, it makes us feel overwhelmed, and particularly as a healthcare provider, it can make you feel weak or inadequate, like I shouldn't be acknowledging that, this is my job. And research has clearly shown that people in the healthcare industry not only experience their own grief as they are navigating through the pain and suffering with others, they're also taking on sometimes the grief and the struggles of the very people that they're serving, leading to secondary forms of grief. So at this point, I thought it would be helpful for us to take pause and take a deeper look at grief. Right now, we know that we are grieving so many things. Grieving the loss of jobs, perhaps, the loss of income, the loss of relationships, the loss of connection, even the loss of events, weddings that are postponed, birthdays that are not going to be celebrated, at least not right now. And then even more painfully is funerals that are being postponed as we can't even be together to grieve and the loss of somebody that we love. But in addition to all of that, it also seems very clear that we are grieving the loss of security, the loss of normalcy, which can leave us feeling really helpless and overwhelmed and powerless. And as a healthcare provider, acknowledging or taking even a moment in the busyness of this traumatic experience that you are going through to take pause and deal with this grief is absolutely essential. Because grief is physical, it is a mental, and it hits at the core essence of who we are. And so I want to make sure that we are taking a solid look at grief and that you're taking good care of yourself around any potential grief that you might be experiencing. So like with everything, the first thing and the most important thing about grief is to acknowledge it and label it. Grief comes in a variety of packages for all of us, and it's most important that you recognize and acknowledge symptoms or behaviors or emotions that you're experiencing, to touch base to figure out, are they actually a function not of your anxiety, not of your physical exhaustion and your overload, but really a function of grief. So the first step is labeling it. Recognize it, get comfortable with it, know that's what it is. As healthcare providers, it's an ongoing struggle of finding the right balance between grieving and stepping into the pain and the sorrow of the people you care for and how that leaves you with some sense of grief and pain and sorrow, and then a sense of detachment for your own emotional well-being to not take on and absorb somebody else's pain to the fullest extent. And related to labeling this as grief is to take the time to go deep and know yourself, engaging in some level of self-compassion. As a healthcare provider, you're great at compassion. You're great at providing compassionate care, compassionate wisdom, compassionate strategies, compassionate techniques. But engaging in self-compassion, particularly under periods of high stress and trauma like we are going through right now, is absolutely critical. So what do I mean by self-compassion? What I'm talking about is being able to go deep, recognize what's happening to yourself, and acknowledge it. And for some people, they can get there through journaling, taking some quiet meditative time to jot down your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences, the things that you might not want to be saying to somebody else, but need to first start acknowledging to yourself. When we don't acknowledge that and we push it off to the side and think, I'll deal with that later, grief becomes complicated. And grieving that we don't address in the current moment down the road runs the risk of becoming depression or post-traumatic stress reactions in the aftermath of COVID-19. So I want you to focus a little bit more on self-compassion and engaging in the self-compassion. It's not self-indulgence. It's about taking really good care of yourself. And the first step in doing that is to know what's bothering you, to know what you're struggling with, to be able to put those thoughts and emotions into a package that you can understand that's very personal and specific to you. When we're grieving, everything feels like a big fog, like we're in a haze. Gaining that clarity can come from quiet meditative time or journaling, putting your thoughts to paper. Being intentional about your self-care is critical. Making sure that you recognize and acknowledge that if you don't engage in intentional self-care or self-compassion, all kinds of things can happen. Your sleep becomes interrupted. And our sleep is the time when our brain begins to catalog the images of the day, the thoughts of the day, sorts and sifts them through to allow us to tap into the portion of our brain that yields its resilience and our ability to cope. So if you're not getting adequate sleep, if it's interrupted sleep because of these thoughts and these concerns and the worry that is appropriate, and I understand is hard to get away from during these particularly high stress time, but doing everything you can to engage in strategies to help you with adequate sleep is critical in helping you cope with whatever you might be experiencing, particularly if it's grief. And finally, I think it's important to know that grief can oftentimes beget more grief. What I mean by that is when we are grieving certain things in the present, it can often be a trigger to past trauma and past experiences of grief. Sometimes people will say to me, why am I thinking about a loss of a loved one from 5 years ago? Or why do I find myself having more images of a traumatic event that happened 20 years ago? When we are grieving, we are vulnerable, and the brain can sometimes then use those signals to trigger old images. I'm sharing that with you so that you are fully aware and not hit by the blind side if this should happen. This is again where effective strategies for coping with grief means stepping fully into it, being prepared to do the work in taking good care of yourself. And if you're not comfortable with talking to families, your family or colleagues, there is professional support. And I am adding a link below to make sure that you know how to get in touch with our office, or we can put you in touch with other resources in your community. You are not in this alone. We are here to support you in whatever way that we can. Stay well, and thank you again for all that you're doing to take care of the people that we love.